Welcome back to the theme component of the Ergo Proxy Retrospective. For this part of the Ergo Proxy theme retrospective, we will be talking of one of the themes which is always hinted at in the background, and that is the Raison D'etre. Now, this is a very prevalent background theme in the series, and the term means reason for being. Now, what this means is the purpose that someone is meant to fulfill, and ultimately what gives someone's life meaning and purpose. While the show ultimately states everyone should have one, it makes a point of discussing where one gets their raison d'etre from, and Ergo Proxy does this by comparing characters which take the opposite approaches to obtaining it, to see the quote best approach. On one side, there are those who favor a deterministic side of things, arguing that the purpose of life should be assigned from the start, or is assigned from the start, and therefore guides the development and entirety of one's life, and even can possibly be lost. This seems to be the persuasion of Daedalus and a good deal of the city government. On the other side, there is a more existential school of thought proclaiming that it is up to the individual to determine their own raison d'etre and work upon their own reasoning. This seems to be the school promoted by Riel, Rawl, and ultimately Vincent and the show itself. But how does it do that? First, let's break down the two schools a little more. The deterministic school, as embodied by Daedalus, proclaims that everyone is created to fill a certain role according to a plan, which is above the individual and perhaps even their own comprehension. Daedalus and the government believe in this, and it is used even to control population numbers and every aspect of society in Ramdao. The argument for this is that exact measurements and assigned roles will allow for the exact precision and order in a society of this kind. Society can therefore be extremely organized and efficient. In addition, if everyone is assigned a role from birth, then they cannot feel any discontent that their life is meaningless, as it was essentially fated to be worth something, or to fulfill some role, or have some meaning. This also has the added benefit of attempting to make everyone feel at least somewhat valuable, as they are literally told from their very beginning of the great role that they are to fulfill. In theory, this approach as taken by Ramdao means that the city can be extremely well organized and that all its citizens can be productive and happy, excelling in their assigned roles that they were literally created for. Unfortunately, that's not how humanity works. Humanity is a very energetic and creative species, often questioning the status quo and seldom staying still. As quick learners, in fact, it is essential for humans to continue learning and questioning in order to fend off complacency, ignorance, stagnation, and ultimately regression. Therefore, the system Ramdao employs, and hopes will create a perfect society, is ultimately incompatible with humanity itself. Where assigning roles can create organization, the resultant apathy from assigned roles can bog down an organization. Where assigning a role could possibly assign value to one, it could also assign them aggravation or discontent should they not like what they're assigned. These can also lead to questioning, which is not something a rigid system like this is well equipped to handle. Even in the best case scenario, where no one ultimately questions the system, all it will end up doing is managing to sustain itself, not evolving and barely treading water, ultimately stagnating. And this stagnation lowers creativity and resolve, making dealing with problems even more difficult when they do arise. A negative feedback loop of sorts arises, where the only constant result is a slow regression, as those maintaining the system grow more and more apathetic towards it. In addition, the idea of assigning a role creates the problem of role obsolescence, or redundance. If one's role is completed or redundant, but their whole existence is predicated upon it, then they too are, according to this system and worldview, redundant and stripped of a good deal of worth and agency, especially if they themselves have heavily played into this outlook. Thus, a theoretically great system is actually very flawed, and its own downfall byproduct of its unsustainable and inhuman ideals. We can see this both in the ruling council and Daedalus. While the ruling powers theoretically could do whatever they want to do in Ramdao, their obsession with maintaining the status quo ultimately means that they don't really do anything, and their great power is essentially squandered, until it's apparent that it's too late to really save the system, and a more forceful vision, that of Rawls, sweeps them aside. They are essentially rendered powerless by their unwillingness to use their power in any way other than exactly prescribed by themselves. Daedalus is a more human example of this. As someone who seems to deeply believe in this determinist outlook, he strives to maintain as much order and control as possible. He sees lab-grown humans not as unnatural or uncomfortable, as many of the other casts do, but instead a sort of odd pinnacle of detail. A pinnacle of detail orientation and organization for maintaining a system which is ultimately meant to do nothing more than sustain itself. With its orderly nature, he thinks that this system, however, is the pinnacle of structure. He lets the false security provided by this swoon him, and in the end grows extremely complacent and ultimately bitter when things don't necessarily play along to how he thinks they should. He is stagnated under the expectation that everyone will stay on script, and when they don't, and when it is apparent that the script isn't even that important, he cannot cope with these revelations and simply gives up. This leads us to discussing the other school of thought mentioned in the series, and that is the Existentialism school of thought. This school of thought asserts that there is purpose in life. However, purpose can only be assigned by the person that it applies to, and thus it is deeply personal. Now, this school of thought is not perfect, and the show does explore some of the flaws associated with it. For one, while the individual can assume their self-worth by assigning their own purpose, determining what that purpose could be is not always easy and often requires a good deal of effort to nail down. We see this with Vincent, who takes a while to fully get on board with his quest for the truth and has to undergo quite a bit of growth along the way. Another flaw of the system is that a person may not necessarily choose the best path for themselves, and this can mean that they pursue goals which may not necessarily be beneficial to themselves or the collective. We see this with Raoul, who ends up pursuing the very self-destructive path of trying to destroy Vincent and drastically reshape the status quo. While these criticisms are justified though, this outlook on life, at least as stated by the show, has much greater strengths. For one, the fact that this system allows the individual to assign their goals and purposes mean that the individual is always invested and encouraged to grow and learn. This feeds into the human nature noted earlier and creates a positive feedback loop, where growth itself may even become a goal. This system encourages growth so that one can pursue their own goals, which will in turn see them grow more. And this in turn fortifies the individual to better deal with unplanned obstacles or situations. Where Daedalus just kind of gives up when it's apparent that the script doesn't really matter, Riel, Vincent, and even Raoul to some extent are comfortable going off script and even trying to make their own script. They learn from revelations and move on with life and go along with the punches. Since faith is not placed in such a rigid and literal system as to place one's assigned role at birth, there is no existential danger of the self being destroyed by a failing system. As a result, while this path may seem more difficult and labor-intensive, it is ultimately more sustainable for the individual and therefore collective society. And that is what Ergo Proxy is telling us in its discussion of the Raison D'etre. It is saying that there is in fact reason and reasons for life, however, they cannot be assigned by others, and that we must be the ones assigning those to ourselves.